Welcome to Sleepy Night History. Tonight, we travel slowly back through time. Outside, the rain falls softly. The night is quiet. And far away in the distant past, a story begins. It begins in the ancient lands surrounding the gentle waters of the Mediterranean Sea. In a world that existed more than 2,000 years ago, at the center of that world stood a city built upon rolling hills beside a calm river. That city was Rome. In the age we are visiting tonight, Rome was already old. Its temples and streets had been shaped by many generations. Stone roads wound between houses and markets. Small shrines stood at street corners. Columns rose above busy public squares, and slowly flowing through the city was the quiet water of the Tiber River. For centuries, Rome had grown from a modest settlement into a powerful republic. Its people believed strongly in tradition. They believed in duty to family, and above all, they believed in duty to the state. The Roman Republic was not ruled by a king. Instead, power was shared among elected officials and an assembly of influential families. At the heart of this political world stood the Roman Senate. Within its marble halls, men in white togas debated laws, taxes, war, and diplomacy. Some families had served the Republic for generations. Their names were respected across the city. Yet beneath the calm surface of Roman life, change was slowly coming. Rome's power had expanded far beyond the hills where it had begun. Roman armies had crossed mountains and seas. They had marched across Italy, across Greece, across North Africa, across Spain. The Republic now ruled vast territories around the Mediterranean. With each victory, wealth flowed into the city. Gold and silver arrived from conquered lands. Grain shipments filled Roman warehouses. Merchants filled the markets with goods from distant provinces. But along with wealth came tension. As Rome grew richer and more powerful, its political system began to strain under the weight of empire. Powerful generals commanded loyal armies. Ambitious politicians sought influence among the people. And slowly, the old traditions of the Republic began to bend. These tensions would shape the world into which a young boy would soon be born. But before that child entered the story, it is worth taking a moment to understand the world around him. The Mediterranean world of the 1st century before Christ was vast and varied. Warm winds carried the scent of olive groves across the countryside. Farmers worked fields of wheat beneath the southern sun. Along the coasts, fishing boats moved quietly across blue waters. Merchants traveled along Roman roads connecting towns and provinces. These roads were among Rome's greatest achievements. They stretched across mountains and valleys. Stone by stone, Roman engineers built pathways strong enough to endure for centuries. Travelers could walk, ride horses, or guide wagons along these roads from one end of the Republic to the other. The roads connected villages to cities, and cities to Rome itself. Within Rome, life followed a rhythm that had developed over many generations. At sunrise, the city slowly came to life. Bakers lit their ovens. Market vendors arranged fruits and vegetables on wooden stalls. Children ran through narrow streets while their parents prepared for the day. Public baths opened their doors. Artisans hammered bronze and shaped clay. And in the grand public square known as the Forum, citizens gathered to discuss politics and news. The Forum was the beating heart of Roman public life. Speakers addressed crowds from stone platforms. Lawyers argued cases before magistrates. Statues of famous leaders looked down upon the busy square. The Republic valued public service. Young men from noble families were expected to pursue political careers. They studied rhetoric. They practiced public speaking. They learned the complex traditions of Roman law. For these young men, honor and reputation mattered deeply. A family's name could open doors in the Senate or close them forever. Among the noble families of Rome were the Julii. This ancient lineage traced its ancestry back through generations of Roman history. Members of the Julian family believed they descended from the legendary hero Aeneas, who in Roman myth had fled the ruins of Troy. One of the most famous members of this family would soon become one of the most powerful men in Roman history. His name was Julius Caesar. In the years before our story truly begins, Caesar was already rising within Roman politics. He was known for his intelligence, for his ambition, and for his remarkable ability to win the loyalty of soldiers. Yet at this point in time, Caesar was still only one figure among many competing for influence in Rome. The Republic was full of powerful personalities. Some men sought reform. Others defended the old traditions of the Senate. Political alliances formed and dissolved. Friendships could turn into rivalries. Rivalries could become bitter enemies. This complicated world of ambition and politics would soon shape the future of Rome in ways few people could imagine. But history often moves quietly at first. Long before great events unfold, life continues in ordinary ways. Families gather for meals. Children learn their lessons. Festivals fill the streets with music and laughter. And somewhere in the city of Rome, in the year 63 before Christ, a child was about to be born. His name would eventually become known across the entire Roman world. But at the moment of his birth, he was simply a small infant in a noble household. He would be called Gaius Octavius. The world would later know him by a different name, a name that would become one of the most famous titles in history, Augustus. But that name still lay far in the future. For now, the story remains in its earliest moments. The child's family belonged to the Roman elite, but they were not yet among the most powerful houses of the Republic. His father was a respected man who had risen through the ranks of Roman public service. His mother came from a distinguished lineage connected to influential political figures. Through her family, the child would have a distant connection to Julius Caesar himself. This connection, though subtle at first, would one day change the course of Roman history. But tonight, our story is only just beginning. The infant Octavian slept quietly in the house where he had been born. Outside, Rome continued its busy rhythm. Merchants traded in the forum. Senators debated matters of state. Soldiers marched along distant frontiers. And beyond the hills of Rome, the vast republic stretched across lands and seas. No one yet knew that this child would grow into the man who would guide Rome through one of the most important transformations in its long history. But time moves slowly, and the life of a future emperor begins, like all lives do, in quiet beginnings. In the next part of our journey, we will move closer to the household where young Octavian grew up. We will explore the family into which he was born, the traditions of Roman noble families, and the early childhood of the boy who would one day become the first emperor of Rome. For now, the city sleeps beneath the calm Mediterranean sky, and the story continues, slowly, with the gentle passage of time. The night in Rome was often peaceful. When the day's markets closed and the crowd slowly faded from the forum, a quieter rhythm settled over the city. Oil lamps flickered inside homes, footsteps echoed softly along stone streets, and the waters of the Tiber River moved slowly through the darkness. It was in this ancient city, in the year 63 before Christ, that the child named Gaius Octavius began his life. The boy who would one day be known as Augustus. But at the time of his birth, there was nothing to suggest that this quiet infant would someday guide the future of Rome. His family was respected, though not among the most powerful in the Republic. The Octavii were an old Italian family whose roots lay in the town of Velletri, south of Rome. For generations, members of the family had served in local government and military roles. They were considered honorable and reliable people. Yet they were not part of the most ancient aristocratic circles that dominated the Roman Senate. This meant that the young Octavian grew up in a household that valued discipline, ambition, and careful advancement. His father, also named Gaius Octavius, had built his career through steady effort. He served as a magistrate in the Roman system and later governed the province of Macedonia. In Rome, such positions required patience and skill. A man moved step by step through a sequence of offices known as the cursus honorum. Each stage brought greater responsibility. Each stage also demanded political alliances and the trust of fellow citizens. Octavian's father had followed this path carefully. He was known as a capable administrator rather than a dramatic public figure. He preferred order and stability. These qualities shaped the atmosphere of the household where Octavian spent his earliest years. The boy's mother, however, connected the family to one of Rome's most famous lineages. Her name was Attia. She belonged to the Julian family. Through her, young Octavian had a distant relationship with the rising political figure known as Julius Caesar. At the time, Caesar was already gaining attention in Roman politics. Yet no one could have predicted how closely the future of this young child would eventually intertwine with Caesar's destiny. Inside the household, life followed the rhythms typical of Roman noble families. The day often began early. Before sunrise, servants prepared the home for the morning. Water was carried from public fountains. Bread was baked in clay ovens. The first light of the sun touched the rooftops of Rome as the city slowly awakened. For a child like Octavian, the early years were filled with lessons about family duty and tradition. Roman culture placed enormous importance on ancestry. Stories about past relatives were often shared around the household. Children were taught the names of their ancestors. They learned about victories in war, achievements in politics, and acts of honor performed by earlier generations. These stories shaped a young Roman's sense of identity. In the atrium of many Roman homes stood wax masks representing ancestors who had held public office. These masks were displayed proudly during family ceremonies. They reminded each generation that they carried the reputation of their lineage. Octavian would have grown up surrounded by such reminders of duty. From an early age, he would have learned that a Roman citizen was expected to contribute to the Republic. Education for young boys of noble families focused on both character and skill. They studied reading and writing in Latin. They learned about Greek literature, which Romans admired deeply. Teachers introduced them to philosophy, history, and rhetoric. Rhetoric was especially important. The ability to speak clearly before a crowd could shape a political career. Many young Romans practiced delivering speeches, learning how to persuade audiences and defend arguments. Yet childhood was not entirely filled with study. Children played games in courtyards and streets. They practiced simple athletic exercises. They watched the busy life of Rome unfolding around them. The city itself served as a kind of classroom.
Public buildings demonstrated Roman engineering and architecture. Temples reminded citizens of the many gods worshipped throughout the Republic. Markets displayed goods arriving from distant lands: olive oil from Spain, grain from Egypt, fine fabrics from the Eastern Mediterranean. All of these elements formed the world that surrounded the young Octavian. But his childhood would soon encounter change.
When Octavian was only a few years old, his father died unexpectedly. The loss altered the course of the family's life. In Roman society, the death of a father placed great responsibility on other relatives. Octavian's upbringing continued under the guidance of his mother and stepfather. His stepfather was Lucius Marcius Philippus. Philippus was an experienced statesman who had served as consul, one of the highest offices in the Republic. He brought stability and political knowledge into the household. Under his influence, Octavian continued to receive a careful education. Family members noticed certain qualities in the boy. He was often quiet and observant. Rather than speaking frequently, he listened. Rather than rushing into action, he seemed to study the behavior of those around him. These traits would remain part of his character throughout his life. In a world where many Roman politicians relied on bold speeches and dramatic gestures, Octavian often preferred patience. As the years passed, the boy grew into adolescence. The city around him was also changing. Roman politics during this period had become increasingly complicated. Powerful generals commanded large armies. Political factions competed for influence in the Senate. Among these figures, Julius Caesar continued to rise in prominence. Caesar's military campaigns in Gaul brought him fame and loyal soldiers. News of his victories traveled back to Rome. Citizens gathered in the forum to hear reports of distant battles. Triumphs were celebrated. Statues were erected. Yet success in Roman politics often created tension. Other leaders feared that Caesar's growing power might threaten the traditional balance of the Republic. Political alliances shifted. Arguments in the Senate became more heated. These developments formed the background of Octavian's youth. Although he was still young, his family connections gradually drew him closer to the world of Roman politics. At gatherings and ceremonies, he may have glimpsed some of the Republic's most influential men. He would have seen senators in their formal robes. He would have listened to discussions about war, diplomacy, and governance. These experiences quietly prepared him for a future he could not yet imagine. As Octavian approached his teenage years, he began participating more actively in Roman civic life. Young nobles sometimes accompanied older relatives to public events. They observed court cases. They listened to debates. They learned how decisions were made within the Republic. During religious festivals, the city transformed into a place of celebration. Processions moved through the streets. Priests carried sacred objects to temples. Music and offerings honored the gods believed to protect Rome. These rituals reinforced the belief that the Republic's success depended on maintaining harmony between citizens, leaders, and the divine world. Octavian grew up surrounded by these traditions. The combination of family guidance, education, and observation gradually shaped his understanding of Roman society. Yet the calm routines of his youth would soon intersect with the dramatic events unfolding in the wider Republic. Because as Octavian matured, the political struggles within Rome were approaching a turning point. And standing near the center of those struggles was the powerful and ambitious Julius Caesar. For the young Octavian, Caesar was more than a distant political figure. He was a relative. And in the years ahead, that relationship would slowly draw the quiet boy from his studies and household life into the complex and unpredictable world of Roman power. But for now, the future still unfolded slowly. The young Octavian continued his education. He walked the streets of Rome. He listened. He observed. And somewhere beyond the city, Julius Caesar's journey toward greatness continued. A journey that would soon change the fate of Rome and the fate of Octavian himself. As our story continues, we will move closer to that connection. We will see how the young Octavian first came into the presence of Julius Caesar, and how the events of the Roman Republic began drawing the quiet young noble into the center of history. The night remains calm. The ancient city rests beneath the stars, and the life of Augustus continues, slowly, through the quiet passage of time. As the years passed, the young Octavian continued to grow within the busy and complicated world of the Roman Republic. Rome itself seemed to change with every season. New temples appeared along the hills. Triumphal arches were raised to celebrate victories abroad. The markets grew louder and more crowded as merchants arrived from distant lands. Yet beneath the familiar routines of the city, politics continued to shift in quiet but powerful ways. One name was heard more often than others in the streets and the Senate. That name was Julius Caesar. By the time Octavian was entering his teenage years, Caesar had become one of the most remarkable figures in the Roman world. His military campaigns in Gaul had expanded Roman territory far to the north. Soldiers who served under him spoke of his leadership with deep loyalty. Stories of long marches, distant forests, and difficult battles spread across the Republic. But Rome had long been cautious about generals who commanded too much power. The traditions of the Republic were built upon a balance. No single man was meant to rule alone. When Caesar's victories made him both famous and powerful, many senators began to worry. Some feared that the Republic might be changing into something else. These tensions slowly grew stronger. Political arguments filled the Senate chamber. Public speeches stirred the crowds in the forum. Old alliances began to weaken. New rivalries formed. Octavian was still young, but he lived close enough to these events to sense that the atmosphere in Rome was becoming uncertain. In the household where he lived with his mother Attila and his stepfather Lucius Marcius Philippus, discussions about politics were not uncommon. Roman families often followed the affairs of the Republic closely. Letters arrived with news from distant provinces. Visitors spoke of debates within the Senate. Sometimes the names of powerful men were mentioned in careful tones. Young Octavian listened to these conversations. He did not yet participate in them, but he observed. He learned, and slowly, the figure of Julius Caesar became more than a distant relative whose name was spoken occasionally in the household. Caesar's presence in Roman life was growing larger. In the year 49 before Christ, tensions between Caesar and the Senate finally reached a turning point. The Senate ordered Caesar to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar made a different choice. He crossed the small river known as the Rubicon with his army. By doing so, he began a civil war. Civil war was something Romans feared deeply. It meant Roman soldiers fighting other Roman soldiers. It meant the Republic was divided against itself. As news of the conflict spread, the city of Rome grew uneasy. Some political leaders fled. Others tried to remain neutral. But Caesar moved quickly. His forces advanced across Italy with little resistance. Before long, he entered Rome itself. The civil war continued for several years across different parts of the Mediterranean world. During this time, Octavian was still completing his education. Yet the events surrounding Caesar were becoming impossible to ignore. By the time Octavian reached the age of 16, Caesar had emerged as the most powerful man in Rome. He held extraordinary authority. The Senate granted him the title of dictator. Originally, the Roman office of dictator was meant to be temporary. It was created to allow strong leadership during moments of crisis. But Caesar's dictatorship lasted longer than many people expected. Some citizens admired him for bringing stability after years of conflict. Others worried that the traditions of the Republic were fading. While these debates continued, Octavian's own life quietly began to move closer to Caesar's world. In Roman culture, young men from noble families often began their public careers in their teenage years. They participated in religious ceremonies. They observed the workings of government. And sometimes, they accompanied powerful relatives on official duties. Octavian's connection to Caesar through his mother's family gradually became more visible. Caesar himself had begun to notice the young man. Those who met Octavian often remarked upon his calm manner. He spoke thoughtfully. He did not rush into arguments. Even at a young age, he appeared unusually composed. Caesar, who had seen many ambitious young nobles during his career, seemed to recognize something promising in the quiet teenager. In time, Caesar invited Octavian to join him on a military campaign in Spain. For a young Roman, traveling with a powerful commander was both an honor and a valuable education. Military service played an important role in the careers of Roman leaders. Even politicians were expected to understand warfare. Octavian accepted the opportunity. The journey would take him away from the familiar streets of Rome and into the wider territories of the Republic.
Before leaving, he spent time preparing for the trip. Travel in the ancient world required patience. Supplies had to be gathered. Routes were planned carefully along the network of Roman roads. Messengers carried letters ahead to arrange accommodations. Eventually, Octavian set out across the Italian countryside. The landscapes he passed were peaceful compared with the tension that had recently surrounded Rome. Farmers worked quietly in their fields. Small villages rested along hillsides. Olive groves and vineyards stretched toward the horizon. For the young man, the journey offered time to reflect. He was leaving behind the familiar rhythm of city life. Ahead of him lay a new experience, one that would introduce him more directly to the responsibilities and challenges of leadership. When Octavian finally arrived to join Caesar, the meeting marked an important moment in his life. Caesar was already a legendary figure. Soldiers respected him deeply. Political supporters admired his intelligence and ambition. Opponents feared his influence. For Octavian, this relative whom he had known mostly through family connections now stood before him as one of the most powerful men in the Roman world. Yet their interaction was not dramatic. Roman culture valued calm dignity in such meetings. Caesar welcomed the young man into his circle. He allowed him to observe military organization and political discussions. Octavian watched carefully. He saw how Caesar spoke with his officers, how he considered advice, how he balanced generosity toward allies with firmness toward rivals. These experiences would remain in Octavian's memory for many years, because although he did not yet realize it, his path was slowly moving toward an unexpected destiny. For the moment, he was simply learning, watching the actions of a man whose decisions shaped the fate of Rome. Meanwhile, back in the city of Rome, the debate about Caesar's power continued. Some senators believed the Republic needed strong leadership. Others believed that the ancient balance of authority must be restored. Whispers of conspiracy began to circulate. A small group of senators feared that Caesar intended to become king. And in Rome, the word king carried dark echoes from the distant past. Centuries earlier, Romans had overthrown their last king and sworn never to be ruled by one again. These fears would soon lead to one of the most famous events in Roman history, an event that would change the course of Octavian's life forever. But that moment still lies ahead in our story. For now, the young Octavian continues his quiet education, traveling, observing, learning the complex world of politics and leadership. The Mediterranean wind moves gently across distant hills. Roman roads stretch across the landscape. And somewhere between youth and adulthood, the future emperor continues his journey, slowly, through the unfolding pages of history. In the next part of our story, we will return to the city of Rome during the final days of Julius Caesar, a time when hidden tensions were reaching their breaking point, and when a single day would change the future of the Roman world forever. Time moved steadily across the Roman world. Seasons passed, the winds shifted across the Mediterranean, and the life of the young Octavian continued quietly for a time. Far from the busy streets of Rome, he remained in the provinces, learning the routines of military command and administration. The Roman Republic was vast. Its lands stretched from the warm coasts of North Africa to the forests of Gaul and eastward toward the ancient cities of Greece. Travel between these regions was slow. Messages often took weeks to arrive. News spread gradually along the network of Roman roads. And so it was that when the most dramatic event in Roman political history unfolded, Octavian was not in the city to witness it. The event occurred on a day that would be remembered for centuries. It was the 15th day of March in the year 44 before Christ. The Romans called it the Ides of March. On that morning, Julius Caesar walked through the streets toward a meeting of the Senate. The Senate had gathered in a hall beside the Grand Theater built by Pompey the Great. Caesar had attended many such meetings before. Public life in Rome was filled with ceremonies, speeches, and debates. Yet on that particular morning, the atmosphere was different. Unknown to Caesar, a group of senators had quietly formed a conspiracy. They believed that Caesar's growing authority threatened the ancient traditions of the Republic. Some of them had once been his allies. Others had long been uneasy about his power. Among them were men such as Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. These senators believed they were acting to preserve the Republic, yet the path they chose would bring enormous consequences.
When Caesar entered the Senate chamber that morning, the conspirators gathered around him. In a sudden moment of violence, they attacked. Within minutes, the most powerful man in Rome lay dead on the floor of the Senate hall. The city fell into shock. Word of the assassination spread quickly through the streets. Crowds gathered in confusion. Some feared new violence might follow. Others wondered what would happen to the Republic now that its most powerful leader was gone. For a brief moment, the conspirators believed they had restored the old order. They imagined that Rome would simply return to its traditional balance of power. But history rarely moves backwards so easily. Caesar had changed the political world of Rome in ways that could not be undone in a single day. Meanwhile, far from the capital, Octavian slowly received news of the event. The message arrived like a distant echo of a storm. The young man learned that his powerful relative had been killed. For anyone connected to Caesar's circle, the news brought uncertainty. Some of Caesar's supporters feared persecution. Others began to consider how the political balance might shift.
At first, Octavian's reaction was quiet and thoughtful. He was only 18 years old. Many young men of his age would have avoided involvement in such dangerous affairs. But Octavian soon received a second message that would alter his life completely. When Caesar's will was opened in Rome, it revealed an unexpected decision. In his final testament, Caesar had adopted Octavian as his son and named him his primary heir. Adoption in Roman society carried enormous significance. It was not simply a personal gesture. It meant that Octavian legally became a member of Caesar's family and inherited his name. From that moment forward, he was known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. More importantly, he inherited Caesar's wealth and political legacy. The announcement surprised many people in Rome. Few had expected that the quiet young relative would become Caesar's successor. For Octavian himself, the news must have felt overwhelming. In a single moment, his life had changed. He was no longer merely a noble youth observing politics from a distance. He now carried the name of Caesar, and with that name came expectations, dangers, and opportunities. Advisors around him offered different suggestions. Some believed he should remain away from Rome until the political situation became clearer. Others encouraged him to travel to the capital and claim his inheritance. After careful thought, Octavian made his decision. He would return to Rome. The journey back to Italy took time. Ships crossed the waters of the Adriatic Sea. Travelers moved along the Roman roads that connected ports to cities. During these days of travel, Octavian had time to reflect on the path ahead. Rome was entering a period of uncertainty. Caesar's death had not restored peace. Instead, it had created a vacuum of power. Several powerful figures were already positioning themselves to shape the future of the Republic. Among them was Mark Antony. Antony had served as one of Caesar's most trusted generals. After the assassination, he had quickly moved to secure Caesar's papers and treasury. Many people assumed that Antony would become the leading defender of Caesar's legacy. The arrival of the young Octavian would complicate those expectations. When Octavian finally reached Italy, he began quietly gathering support. Some of Caesar's former soldiers remembered their loyalty to Caesar. When they heard that Caesar had named Octavian as his heir, they began to view the young man with interest. Others were uncertain. Octavian was still very young. He had not yet commanded armies or held public office. Yet those who met him noticed something unusual. He remained calm. He spoke carefully. He listened before making decisions. Rather than rushing into conflict, he moved step by step. This patience allowed him to navigate the complicated politics of Rome. Soon after arriving in the capital, Octavian officially accepted Caesar's adoption. He took the name Gaius Julius Caesar. Although historians would later refer to him as Octavian to distinguish him from his adoptive father, in his own time he was already presenting himself as Caesar's rightful heir. The city watched closely.
Some citizens welcomed the young man who carried Caesar's name. Others wondered whether he could survive the dangerous world of Roman politics. Because Rome at that moment was filled with rival ambitions. Mark Antony held considerable influence. The conspirators who had killed Caesar still believed they had saved the Republic. The Senate hoped to maintain stability. And now, quietly stepping into this complicated stage, was an 18-year-old heir with the name of Caesar. The story of Rome was entering a new chapter, one that would unfold slowly through alliances, rivalries, and careful decisions. For Octavian, the path ahead would require patience and strategy. He would need allies. He would face enemies. And the destiny that awaited him was still hidden beyond the horizon.
For now, he had only taken the first step. The young heir had returned to Rome. The city's ancient streets lay before him, and the future of the Roman world was beginning to shift once again. As our story continues, we will follow Octavian's first careful moves within the political life of Rome. Moves that would slowly transform a quiet young heir into one of the most powerful leaders the ancient world had ever known. When the young heir of Caesar entered the city, the atmosphere of Rome was still unsettled. The assassination of Julius Caesar had taken place only weeks earlier, yet the city had not returned to calm. Rumors moved through the streets. In the markets and public squares, citizens spoke quietly about what might happen next. Some believed the Republic had been saved. Others feared that Caesar's supporters would seek revenge. And in the middle of this uncertain world stood the young man who had inherited Caesar's name. At only 18 years of age, Octavian entered Rome with a calm demeanor. He did not arrive with a large army or dramatic announcements. Instead, he moved carefully, meeting people one by one. He visited friends of Caesar. He spoke with soldiers who had once served under his adoptive father. He listened to the advice of experienced politicians. These early days required patience. Octavian understood that the name of Caesar could inspire loyalty, but it could also provoke suspicion. Many senators viewed him with curiosity. Some underestimated him entirely. To them, he appeared to be a quiet youth stepping into a dangerous world far beyond his experience. But Octavian did not rush to prove himself. He watched, he listened, and he slowly began building connections. One of the most powerful figures in Rome at that time was Mark Antony. Antony had been a close ally of Caesar during the Civil War. He had fought beside him in several campaigns and had served as consul, one of the highest offices in the Roman government. After Caesar's death, Antony had quickly taken control of many of Caesar's official documents and funds. For a moment, it seemed that Antony might become the primary guardian of Caesar's political legacy. Yet the appearance of Caesar's adopted heir created a complicated situation. Octavian requested a meeting with Antony. When the two men finally spoke, the conversation was polite but cautious. Antony was older and far more experienced. He had commanded armies and spoken before crowds in the forum. Octavian, by contrast, was still a newcomer to the highest levels of Roman politics. Antony initially treated the young heir with a certain degree of condescension. He did not immediately hand over Caesar's financial inheritance, nor did he offer full political support. But Octavian did not respond with anger. Instead, he continued working quietly. He used the inheritance promised in Caesar's will to distribute money to Roman citizens. Caesar had left a gift for the people of Rome, and Octavian made sure it was delivered. This act gained him considerable goodwill among the population. Ordinary citizens remembered Caesar's generosity. Seeing the young heir fulfill that promise strengthened their respect for him. Meanwhile, tensions between different factions of Roman politics continued to grow. Some senators had participated in the assassination of Caesar. Among them were figures such as Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. These men believed they had acted in defense of the Republic, but they soon discovered that public opinion was not entirely on their side. Many citizens still admired Caesar, and the sudden appearance of his adopted heir complicated the political balance even further. The Senate itself found it difficult to navigate this uncertain situation. Some senators hoped to weaken Antony's influence by encouraging Octavian. Others hoped the two men might balance each other's power. Octavian recognized that alliances in Rome were often temporary. He therefore avoided tying himself too closely to any single faction too quickly. Instead, he focused on gaining legitimacy. He emphasized his legal adoption by Caesar. He carefully used the name Caesar in public appearances.
This strategy allowed him to attract veterans who had once served under his adoptive father. Roman soldiers were often deeply loyal to the commanders who had led them in battle. When they heard that Caesar's heir had arrived in Rome, many began to see Octavian as the natural continuation of their former leader's legacy. These veterans gradually became one of Octavian's most important sources of support. At the same time, political tensions between Antony and the Senate were beginning to intensify. Some senators feared Antony's growing influence. Among them was the famous orator Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero had long been one of the most respected voices in Roman public life. He believed that Antony's ambitions threatened the traditional institutions of the Republic. In a series of powerful speeches delivered in the Senate, Cicero openly criticized Antony. These speeches, later known as the Philippics, stirred strong emotions in Rome. Cicero also saw potential in the young Octavian. He believed that Octavian might help counterbalance Antony's power. For a time, Cicero supported Octavian's rise in Roman politics. This support helped strengthen the young man's position within the Senate. Yet Octavian never forgot that Roman alliances could shift quickly. He accepted Cicero's encouragement, but he continued pursuing his own careful strategy. Slowly, the political landscape began to change. The Senate granted Octavian certain official powers. Although he was still very young, his influence continued to grow. Meanwhile, Antony left Rome to command military forces in northern Italy. The situation gradually moved toward confrontation. Octavian began raising troops among Caesar's veterans. These soldiers believed they were defending Caesar's legacy. Tensions between Antony and the Senate eventually led to armed conflict. Roman history was once again entering a period of civil war. Yet even during these uncertain months, Octavian maintained the same quiet demeanor that had characterized him since childhood. He rarely spoke impulsively. He preferred careful preparation. Observers who met him often remarked upon his discipline. Unlike many Roman leaders who relied on dramatic speeches or bold gestures, Octavian advanced through patience and steady planning. The struggles between Antony, the Senate, and Octavian would soon reshape the entire Roman political system. But those events would unfold gradually over the coming years. For now, the young heir continued his work in Rome, walking through the Forum, meeting soldiers and senators, learning how power moved within the ancient republic. The city itself continued its daily life. Bakers opened their shops each morning. Merchants filled the markets with grain, olives, and wine. Citizens gathered to discuss news beneath the statues of famous leaders. And somewhere among those crowds moved the quiet young man who carried the name of Caesar. He was still only at the beginning of his journey. Yet step by step, his influence was growing. The Roman Republic had entered a time of uncertainty, and within that uncertainty, the future emperor continued building his path. In the next part of our story, the tensions between Octavian, Mark Antony, and the Senate will lead to new alliances and unexpected partnerships. Partnerships that will shape the fate of Rome for years to come. For the story of Augustus is not only the story of one man, it is also the story of how an ancient republic slowly transformed into an empire. And that transformation was only just beginning. The city of Rome continued its daily rhythm, even as political tensions slowly deepened. Each morning, the markets opened beneath the soft light of the Italian sun. Farmers arrived with carts of grain and vegetables. Merchants displayed fabrics, pottery, and oil. Citizens gathered in the forum to hear news. To an outside observer, life in Rome might have appeared almost ordinary. Yet behind the familiar routines, the leaders of the Republic were quietly preparing for another period of conflict. The uneasy balance between the Senate, Mark Antony, and the young heir of Caesar was beginning to break apart. During the months after the assassination of Julius Caesar, alliances had formed and dissolved repeatedly. Some senators hoped that Octavian might serve as a useful counterweight against Antony's growing influence. But Octavian himself was learning quickly that Roman politics rarely followed simple plans. Power shifted constantly, friendships could change overnight, and survival often depended on patience and careful timing. As tensions grew, Antony's relationship with the Senate became increasingly strained. Antony had taken control of important territories and resources. Many senators worried that he might attempt to dominate Roman politics in the same way Caesar had done. The orator Marcus Tullius Cicero continued speaking against Antony in the Senate. His speeches criticized Antony's ambitions and warned that the Republic must defend its traditions. These speeches were widely discussed throughout the city. Crowds gathered in the forum to hear them repeated by supporters. For a time, Cicero believed that Octavian could help restore balance to the Republic. The young heir appeared calm and cooperative. He had shown respect for the Senate, and he had fulfilled Caesar's promise to distribute gifts to the Roman people. But Octavian's ambitions were quietly expanding. He understood that Rome was entering a new era. The old republican system was struggling to govern such a vast empire. Many citizens longed for stability after years of civil war, and stability often required strong leadership. As Antony gathered military forces in northern Italy, the Senate made a decision that would alter the political landscape. They officially authorized Octavian to command troops in defense of the Republic. For an 18-year-old to receive such authority was unusual. Yet the Senate believed the situation demanded bold action. Octavian began assembling an army composed largely of veterans who had once served under Caesar. These soldiers respected Caesar's memory. When they heard that his adopted son was calling for their support, many joined willingly. Soon, Roman forces loyal to the Senate and Octavian moved northward. Their goal was to confront Antony's troops near the town of Mutina. The confrontation that followed became one of the early military struggles in the long series of conflicts that would eventually reshape Rome. The battles near Mutina were difficult and costly. Several Roman commanders lost their lives. But in the end, Antony's forces were forced to withdraw. For the moment, the Senate appeared victorious. Octavian returned south with his army, yet the political situation soon became more complicated. Many senators believed that their victory meant the Republic had been restored. They began treating Octavian as a young subordinate rather than a powerful ally. Octavian noticed this shift immediately. Although he had helped defeat Antony, the Senate now seemed reluctant to reward him with lasting authority. This realization led him to reconsider his strategy. Octavian understood that relying entirely on the Senate might leave him vulnerable. He therefore began exploring other possibilities. One of those possibilities involved a surprising reconciliation. Despite their earlier conflict, Octavian eventually entered negotiations with Antony. Both men recognized that continued rivalry could weaken them, while other factions gained influence. There was also a third powerful figure involved in Roman politics. His name was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Lepidus had served as a loyal supporter of Caesar and controlled significant military forces. The three men, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, began discussing the possibility of cooperation. Their discussions eventually led to the formation of a powerful political alliance. This alliance would later be known as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike earlier informal partnerships, this new arrangement received official legal authority from the Roman state. The triumvirs were granted extraordinary powers to restore order to the Republic. In practice, this meant they controlled the government, the armies, and the provinces of Rome. For Octavian, the alliance marked a major turning point. Only a few years earlier, he had been an unknown young noble. Now he stood alongside two experienced generals as one of the rulers of the Roman world. Yet the triumvirate was not simply a partnership of equals. Each member controlled different regions and armies. Each also watched the others carefully. Trust between powerful leaders was never guaranteed. Even within the alliance, competition quietly continued. One of the first actions taken by the triumvirs was to pursue those responsible for Caesar's assassination. The conspirators had fled eastward after the events in Rome. Many of them gathered forces in Greece and the eastern provinces. Among them were the prominent leaders Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. The triumvirs prepared to confront them. Roman armies began moving across the Mediterranean once again. Soldiers marched along the ancient roads. Ships carried legions across the sea toward Greece. The decisive confrontation eventually took place near the city of Philippi. There, the forces of the triumvirate met the armies of Brutus and Cassius. The battles were intense and difficult, but in the end, the conspirators were defeated. With their deaths, the men who had killed Caesar were removed from the stage of Roman politics. The triumph strengthened the authority of the triumvirate, yet victory also raised new questions. With their enemies defeated, how would the triumvirs share power? Rome's territories were vast. Different regions required administration. Armies needed leadership. The three rulers therefore divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian received control of the western provinces. Antony governed much of the eastern Mediterranean. Lepidus held territories in North Africa. For the moment, the arrangement created a fragile peace. Citizens hoped that the long cycle of civil wars might finally be ending. But history often moves in gradual steps. Although the triumvirate had restored order temporarily, deeper tensions remained. Ambition still lived within the hearts of powerful men, and the future of Rome would once again depend on how those ambitions unfolded. Meanwhile, Octavian returned to Italy to oversee his territories. He continued strengthening his connections with soldiers and citizens alike. His calm and deliberate style remained unchanged. He rarely acted in haste. Instead, he studied each situation carefully. The young heir who had once arrived quietly in Rome was slowly becoming a central figure in the transformation of the Roman world. The republic that had governed Rome for centuries was changing, and the story of Augustus was only beginning to reveal the path ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the evolving relationship between Octavian and Mark Antony as their alliance slowly begins to shift. For although they had become partners in power, their destinies were moving toward a rivalry that would shape the future of the Roman Empire. In the years that followed the victory at Philippi, the Roman world entered a period of uneasy calm. The enemies of Caesar had been defeated. The great conspirators were gone. For the moment, the three rulers of the triumvirate governed the republic together. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus held authority in North Africa. Mark Antony traveled east to organize the provinces of the eastern Mediterranean. And in the west, the young heir of Caesar returned to Italy. That young heir was now firmly known as Caesar's successor. The man we have been calling Octavian was officially known as Gaius Julius Caesar. But historians would later continue calling him Octavian during these years to distinguish him from his adoptive father. He returned to the lands surrounding Rome with an enormous responsibility. Italy itself had suffered greatly during decades of civil war. Many veterans of Caesar's armies expected rewards for their service. Land was promised to them. Homes were promised. And it was Octavian's task to settle these soldiers and maintain stability in the heart of the Roman world. This work proved more difficult than it first appeared. Large numbers of soldiers needed land, but farmland was already owned by families who had lived there for generations. In order to provide land for veterans, property had to be redistributed. Villages were affected. Farmers were forced to relocate. These decisions created resentment among some citizens of Italy. Yet Octavian handled the situation with patience. He traveled across the countryside. He listened to local leaders. He worked to balance the needs of soldiers and civilians as carefully as possible. The work was slow and often frustrating, but it allowed him to strengthen his reputation among the army. Roman soldiers valued leaders who honored promises. By ensuring that veterans received their rewards, Octavian gradually deepened their loyalty. Meanwhile, far across the Mediterranean, Mark Antony had established his headquarters in the eastern provinces. The cities of the Greek world were ancient and cultured. Many of them had been centers of learning long before Rome rose to power. Antony spent time traveling among these cities, reorganizing their governments and gathering resources. It was during this time that Antony's life became closely connected with one of the most famous rulers of the eastern Mediterranean. Her name was Cleopatra. Cleopatra ruled the rich kingdom of Egypt from the city of Alexandria. Her court was known for its wealth, scholarship, and cultural refinement. Egypt's fertile lands along the Nile River produced enormous quantities of grain. This grain helped feed cities throughout the Mediterranean. For Roman leaders, Egypt was therefore extremely important. Antony traveled to meet Cleopatra as part of his work organizing the eastern provinces. Their meeting soon grew into a powerful alliance. Cleopatra supported Antony politically and financially. In return, Antony strengthened Egypt's position within the region. Over time, their relationship also became deeply personal. Stories of their partnership traveled across the Mediterranean world. Some admired the alliance, others viewed it with suspicion. In Rome, reports of Antony's life in the East began to shape public opinion. Roman culture valued discipline and simplicity in leadership. Antony's luxurious lifestyle in Alexandria seemed very different from traditional Roman ideals. These differences would eventually become important in the rivalry that was slowly developing between Antony and Octavian. Back in Italy, Octavian continued strengthening his influence. He surrounded himself with capable advisors. Among the most important of these was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa had grown up with Octavian and had become one of his most trusted companions. Unlike many politicians of Rome, Agrippa was known primarily as a soldier and engineer. He possessed a practical mind and a steady temperament. Agrippa would later become one of the greatest generals of the Roman age. During these early years, however, his friendship with Octavian was already proving invaluable. Together, the two men worked carefully to strengthen their position in Italy. They improved relations with the Roman army. They organized the administration of the western provinces, and they paid close attention to events unfolding in the east. Although the triumvirate still officially ruled together, subtle tensions were beginning to appear. Lepidus gradually lost influence. Antony and Octavian increasingly stood as the two dominant figures within the Roman world. For several years, the alliance between them continued, but the balance was delicate. Political marriages were sometimes used in Rome to strengthen alliances. In an effort to maintain harmony, Antony married Octavian's sister. Her name was Octavia Minor. Octavia was widely respected in Roman society. She was known for her dignity and intelligence. For a time, the marriage helped maintain peace between the two powerful leaders. Yet even as this family connection existed, Antony continued his relationship with Cleopatra in the east. The situation grew increasingly complicated. Rome watched closely. Citizens wondered how long the fragile balance between the two rulers could last. Meanwhile, Octavian continued presenting himself as the defender of Roman tradition. He emphasized his connection to Julius Caesar. He reminded citizens that his leadership aimed to restore order and stability. Gradually, public opinion in Rome began to shift. Antony's association with Cleopatra created unease among many Romans. Some feared that Antony might place the interests of Egypt above those of Rome. Others believed that his lifestyle in Alexandria had distanced him from Roman values. Octavian did not openly attack Antony at first. Instead, he allowed these concerns to grow quietly among the population. His approach remained consistent with the patience he had shown throughout his career. He waited, he observed, and slowly, he prepared for the moment when the balance of power would inevitably change. Years passed. The Mediterranean world continued its daily life. Ships crossed the sea carrying grain and goods. Cities prospered under Roman administration. Yet beneath the calm surface, the rivalry between Octavian and Antony was steadily deepening. Two powerful leaders now stood at the center of the Roman world. Each commanded armies. Each possessed loyal supporters. Each believed his path offered the best future for Rome. The alliance that had once united them was slowly becoming something else. Something quieter, but more dangerous. A rivalry that would soon shape the destiny of the entire Roman Empire. And as that rivalry grew stronger, the world watched. For the story of Augustus was moving steadily toward one of the most decisive moments in Roman history. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, the two rulers continued governing their distant halves of the Roman world. The Mediterranean remained calm. The Roman roads carried travelers across provinces and mountains, and history moved forward, slowly, toward the final contest that would decide the future of Rome. Years continued to pass across the lands of the Roman world. The Mediterranean Sea remained busy with ships moving quietly between its many ports. Merchants carried wine, olive oil, and grain across the waters. Travelers walked along the long network of Roman roads. And in the city of Rome, life continued with its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath the calm appearance of daily life, the rivalry between two powerful leaders was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Those two men were Mark Antony and the young heir of Caesar, the man who would later be known as Augustus. For several years, their alliance had held the Roman world together. But alliances built upon necessity rarely last forever. Gradually, events began pulling the two men in different directions. In the eastern Mediterranean, Antony continued spending much of his time in the city of Alexandria. Alexandria was unlike Rome. It was a city filled with libraries, scholars, and wide streets lined with marble buildings. The harbor was one of the busiest in the ancient world. Ships from distant lands anchored beside its long quays. Within the royal palace of Alexandria ruled Cleopatra. Cleopatra was known for her intelligence and political skill. She spoke several languages and maintained diplomatic relationships with many leaders across the Mediterranean. Her kingdom of Egypt was wealthy and strategically important. The fertile lands along the Nile River produced enormous amounts of grain. Rome depended heavily on Egyptian grain to feed its population. For this reason alone, Egypt held enormous importance within Roman politics. The alliance between Antony and Cleopatra, therefore, carried both personal and political significance. Their partnership allowed Antony to secure resources for his campaigns in the east. At the same time, Cleopatra strengthened her kingdom's influence within the Roman world. But in Rome, many citizens viewed this relationship with growing concern. Roman tradition valued restraint and loyalty to the Republic. Stories circulating about Antony's life in Alexandria seemed very different from those ideals. Some reports described lavish celebrations and luxurious courts. Whether these stories were entirely accurate mattered less than how they shaped public opinion. Meanwhile, in the West, Octavian continued presenting himself as the protector of Roman tradition. He worked closely with his trusted friend and general, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa proved to be one of the most capable military commanders of the age. He reorganized naval forces, he strengthened military infrastructure, and he remained completely loyal to Octavian. Together, the two men gradually strengthened their position within Italy and the western provinces. Octavian also paid close attention to public opinion in Rome. He spoke often about stability, about tradition, about restoring peace after years of civil war. Citizens who had grown tired of conflict listened carefully.
For decades, Rome had been shaken by political violence and military struggles. Many people simply wished for a period of lasting calm. As time passed, tensions between Octavian and Antony became more visible. One particularly significant moment came when Antony officially acknowledged children he had with Cleopatra. He also granted territories in the eastern Mediterranean to these children. These decisions were announced during a ceremony, sometimes referred to as the Donations of Alexandria. In Rome, the news caused deep unease. Many Romans believed that Antony was placing too much power in the hands of Cleopatra and her family. They worried that Roman territories might gradually fall under the influence of Egypt. Octavian recognized the political opportunity this situation created. He carefully presented himself as the defender of Roman independence. His supporters began speaking openly about Antony's growing connection with Cleopatra. They suggested that Antony might even move the center of Roman power away from Rome itself. Whether or not these fears were realistic, they spread widely among the population. Gradually, the rivalry between the two leaders moved closer to open conflict. The Senate in Rome eventually took a decisive step. Instead of declaring war directly against Antony, they declared war against Cleopatra and the Kingdom of Egypt. This distinction allowed Octavian to frame the coming struggle as a defense of Rome against foreign influence. Preparations for war began across the Mediterranean. Shipbuilders worked along coastal cities. Armies gathered. Naval fleets were assembled. Agrippa took command of Octavian's naval forces. His careful planning and disciplined leadership would soon play a crucial role in the coming conflict. Meanwhile,
Antony and Cleopatra gathered their own fleet and armies in the eastern Mediterranean. Their forces included experienced Roman soldiers as well as allies from various eastern kingdoms. The stage was slowly being set for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Roman world. Yet even as preparations continued, daily life across the empire moved forward. Farmers harvested crops, merchants traveled between cities, families gathered for meals beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. For many ordinary people, the struggles of powerful leaders felt distant and uncertain. But history was quietly approaching a turning point. In the year 31 before Christ, the fleets of Octavian and Antony finally met near the western coast of Greece. The location was a narrow stretch of sea near the town of Actium. The battle that followed would become one of the most famous naval engagements in ancient history. Agrippa's fleet proved highly disciplined and well organized. His ships moved carefully across the water, blocking Antony's attempts to maneuver. After hours of struggle on the sea, the outcome became clear. Antony's fleet began to break formation. During the confusion, Cleopatra's ships withdrew toward Egypt. Antony followed. The remaining forces gradually surrendered. The victory at Actium changed everything. For Octavian, it marked the moment when his long rivalry with Antony finally came to an end. The Roman world now had only one dominant leader. Yet even after such a decisive victory, Octavian continued acting with the same patience and caution that had guided him throughout his life. He did not immediately claim the title of king. Romans still remembered their ancient rejection of monarchy. Instead, he moved carefully to reshape the political structure of Rome. The transformation from republic to empire would happen gradually, and the quiet young heir of Caesar would soon become the central figure in that transformation. But that moment still lies ahead. For now, the Mediterranean waters grow calm again after the clash of fleets. The ships drift gently beneath the wide sky, and the man who will one day be known as Augustus continues moving forward, step by step, toward the final chapter of his remarkable life. After the great naval battle near Actium, the balance of power across the Mediterranean had changed completely. The long rivalry between Mark Antony and the heir of Caesar was coming to its quiet conclusion. For many years, the Roman world had been shaped by shifting alliances and repeated civil wars. Now, after the victory at Actium, only one dominant leader remained. Yet even after such a decisive moment, the young ruler did not rush forward with bold proclamations. His nature had always been cautious. He preferred slow and steady progress rather than sudden change. The defeated forces of Antony and Cleopatra retreated toward Egypt. Their remaining ships crossed the eastern Mediterranean and returned to the great harbor of Alexandria. There they attempted to gather what strength remained. Meanwhile, Octavian and his loyal general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa carefully prepared the next stage of their campaign. Months passed as fleets were repaired and armies reorganized. The Mediterranean world watched quietly. Many cities that had once supported Antony gradually shifted their loyalty. Merchants, governors, and soldiers often preferred to align themselves with the side that promised stability. And stability now seemed to lie with the victor of Actium. Eventually, Octavian's forces advanced toward Egypt. Their journey followed the familiar Roman routes across the eastern Mediterranean. Ships moved steadily south along the coast. Soldiers marched along dusty roads beneath the bright sky. When Octavian finally approached Alexandria, the situation within the city had already begun to unravel. Antony's remaining supporters were uncertain. Some officers abandoned their positions. Others attempted to negotiate. For years, Antony had been one of the most powerful men in the Roman world. Now his influence was fading. The final days of Antony and Cleopatra unfolded quietly amid the great palaces of Alexandria. When it became clear that Octavian's forces would soon enter the city, both leaders faced a future they could not accept. Antony, once a celebrated general of Rome, died within the palace walls. Cleopatra followed soon after. With their deaths, the long struggle for control of the Roman world finally came to an end. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror destroying the city, but as a careful administrator securing its wealth and resources. Egypt became a Roman province. Its grain supply would now serve the needs of Rome directly. This development held enormous importance. For decades, the city of Rome had depended heavily on Egyptian grain shipments to feed its large population. Control of Egypt strengthened Octavian's position immensely. Yet even with this victory, he continued acting with remarkable restraint. Romans had long distrusted the idea of kings. Centuries earlier, the Roman Republic had been founded after the overthrow of monarchy. Any leader who appeared too eager to claim royal power risked provoking resistance. Octavian understood this history very well. Rather than declaring himself king, he returned to Rome and gradually reshaped the government through careful reforms. When he arrived in the capital, citizens welcomed him with relief. Many people were simply grateful that the long cycle of civil wars seemed finally to be ending. Octavian began presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. He emphasized that the Republic's institutions would remain. The Senate would continue meeting. Magistrates would still be elected. Public ceremonies and traditions would remain unchanged. Yet behind this familiar structure, real authority slowly gathered in his hands. In the year 27 before Christ, a remarkable event took place. Octavian formally announced that he was returning authority to the Senate and the Roman people. It was a symbolic gesture. The Senate responded by granting him new honors and responsibilities. Among these honors was a new title. From that moment forward, he would be known as Augustus. The title carried deep meaning. It suggested dignity, respect, and a kind of sacred authority. Yet it did not openly declare him king. This careful balance allowed Augustus to lead the Roman world while preserving the outward appearance of republican tradition. Gradually, Augustus reorganized the government. He reformed the army. He strengthened the administration of provinces. He improved the collection of taxes. His trusted friend Agrippa helped oversee many construction projects within Rome itself. Temples were restored. Aqueducts were repaired. Public buildings rose along the hills of the ancient city. Augustus once famously remarked that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Yet his influence extended far beyond architecture. Under his leadership, the Roman world entered a long period of relative peace. Historians would later call this era the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean.
Roads remained safe for travelers. Cities prospered. For ordinary citizens, life gradually became more stable than it had been for generations. Despite holding immense power, Augustus continued maintaining the image of a modest public servant. He dressed simply. He attended Senate meetings. He allowed traditional institutions to function.
Yet everyone understood that his authority guided the entire system. Years turned into decades. The young heir who had once returned quietly to Rome had become the central figure of an enormous empire. But Augustus never forgot the fragile path that had brought him there. The memories of civil war remained close in his mind. He understood how easily the Roman world could fall into chaos again. And so he governed carefully, patiently, always aware of the delicate balance between power and tradition. As time continued its steady passage, Augustus entered the later years of his life. The empire he had shaped stretched from Spain to Syria, from the northern forests of Europe to the deserts of North Africa. Yet even as Rome prospered, the emperor himself began reflecting on the long journey that had carried him from a quiet childhood to the center of history. The story of Augustus was not yet finished, but the foundations of the Roman Empire had now been firmly laid. And in the years that remained, the aging ruler would turn his thoughts increasingly toward the question that faces every leader eventually. Who would follow him? And how would the empire endure after his time had passed? That quiet question would shape the final chapters of his remarkable life. And as our journey continues, we will follow Augustus through those later years. Years of reflection, family struggles, and careful preparation for the future of Rome. As the years passed, the empire that Augustus had shaped began to settle into a new rhythm. The great struggles that had once shaken the Roman world slowly faded into memory. Trade flowed steadily along the Mediterranean Sea. Roads stretched safely across provinces and mountains. Cities grew prosperous beneath the quiet protection of Roman authority. For many citizens, life had become calmer than it had been for generations. This long period of stability would later be remembered as the beginning of the Pax Romana. Merchants traveled without fear of constant warfare. Farmers harvested crops beneath peaceful skies. Roman law provided order across lands that had once been divided by conflict. And at the center of this vast world stood Augustus. Yet despite his enormous power, Augustus continued presenting himself carefully. He never openly claimed to be a king. Instead, he maintained the image of a leader serving the Roman people. He attended meetings of the Senate. He consulted advisors. He allowed traditional offices to continue functioning. But quietly, authority still flowed through him. One of the most important questions during these years concerned the future. Augustus had built a stable system of government. But every human life eventually reaches its later chapters. And Augustus understood that Rome would need a capable successor. The challenge was complicated. The Roman Republic had never been designed for hereditary rule. There was no official position called emperor. Augustus himself had carefully constructed his authority through a combination of titles and responsibilities. Choosing a successor required patience and careful planning. At first, Augustus hoped that leadership might pass through members of his own family. His personal life, however, had never been entirely simple. Like many Roman nobles, Augustus had experienced several marriages during his lifetime. One of the most important figures within his household was his wife, Livia Drusilla. Livia was known for her intelligence and strong character. She became a respected presence within the imperial household. Many advisors valued her judgment. Augustus also cared deeply about his daughter, Julia the Elder. Through Julia, Augustus hoped to establish a line of successors who could continue guiding the empire. Julia married several men during her life, including the talented general Marcus Agrippa. Together, they had children who were seen as potential heirs. For a time, it seemed possible that Augustus would pass leadership to his grandsons. The young boys, named Gaius and Lucius Caesar, were carefully prepared for future responsibility. They were introduced to public life at an early age.
Citizens saw them during ceremonies and public gatherings. Augustus hoped they would eventually inherit his role. But history does not always follow the plans of even the most powerful rulers. Both young heirs died while still very young. Their loss deeply affected Augustus.
The emperor who had successfully guided the Roman world through decades of political change now faced uncertainty within his own household. Gradually, attention turned toward another possible successor. This man had grown up within the extended family of Augustus. His name was Tiberius. Tiberius was the son of Livia from a previous marriage. He had proven himself capable as a military commander. He had governed provinces and led Roman armies along the frontiers of the empire. Yet his relationship with Augustus was complex. Tiberius was known for his reserved personality. He preferred military life to the political atmosphere of Rome. For many years, Augustus hesitated before naming him as successor. But as time passed and other heirs were lost, the decision gradually became clearer. Eventually, Augustus formally adopted Tiberius into his family. This adoption allowed Tiberius to become the legal heir to Augustus's authority. The arrangement ensured that leadership of the empire would pass smoothly when the time came. While these family matters unfolded, Augustus continued overseeing the administration of the Roman world. He rarely rushed decisions. Even in old age, he remained careful and thoughtful. His daily routine was modest compared to the luxury many rulers might have embraced. He often rose early. He read letters from governors across the provinces. He met with advisors and officials. He attended religious ceremonies and public events. The emperor also devoted attention to the physical appearance of Rome. Under his leadership, the city had undergone remarkable transformation. Temples were restored. New public buildings appeared along the hills and valleys of the capital. One of the most peaceful monuments from this era was the Ara Pacis, the Altar of Peace. Its marble carvings celebrated the stability and prosperity of Augustus's reign. Citizens visiting the monument could see images representing the harmony that Augustus hoped his leadership had brought to the Roman world. Yet even as the empire flourished, Augustus increasingly reflected upon the long journey of his life. He had been only 18 when he returned to Rome after the death of Julius Caesar. At that time, few people believed the quiet young heir could survive the dangerous world of Roman politics. Decades had passed since then. Civil wars had ended. Enemies had risen and fallen. The Roman Republic had slowly transformed into an empire, and Augustus had guided that transformation with remarkable patience. In his later years, the emperor sometimes traveled across Italy. These journeys allowed him to visit cities and communities throughout the peninsula. People gathered to greet him. For many citizens, Augustus had been the only ruler they had known during their lifetime. His leadership had brought stability after decades of turmoil. Eventually, Augustus spent increasing time away from the crowded life of Rome. He preferred quieter surroundings where he could rest and reflect. The burdens of leadership had been heavy, yet he remained attentive to the future of the empire he had built. As the years continued their gentle passage, the emperor approached the final stage of his life. The quiet child, born in 63 before Christ, had lived through one of the most dramatic transformations in Roman history. From the uncertain days of the late Republic to the peaceful stability of the early empire. And soon, the story of Augustus would reach its final chapter. But before that moment arrived, there remained time for reflection. Time to consider the legacy he would leave behind.
and time to prepare the Roman world for the transition that awaited after his passing. In the next part of our journey, we will follow Augustus through the final years of his life, the last travels, the final conversations, and the peaceful closing moments of a life that had quietly reshaped the ancient world.
As the final years of the life of Augustus slowly approached, the Roman world continued moving in its steady and familiar rhythm. The empire stretched across vast lands, from the forests of northern Europe to the warm deserts of the south, from the western shores of Spain to the ancient cities of the eastern Mediterranean. Roman roads carried travelers through mountains and valleys. Ships crossed the calm waters of the sea, carrying grain, wine, olive oil, and countless other goods. Across these wide territories, millions of people lived under the quiet authority of Rome. And at the center of this enormous system stood the aging ruler who had shaped it. Augustus was now well into his later years. The young heir who had once returned to Rome with uncertainty in his future had become a figure of almost legendary status. Yet his daily life remained surprisingly simple. He preferred modest clothing. He avoided excessive luxury. He often spent his mornings reading reports sent from distant provinces. Governors wrote to him about harvests, taxes, construction projects, and military matters along the empire's borders. Augustus read these letters carefully. He responded with instructions that helped maintain order across the vast territories of Rome. Although he possessed immense authority, he continued presenting himself as a servant of the Roman state rather than a monarch. This careful balance had allowed his system of government to endure for many years. But time moves forward quietly. Even emperors grow old, and Augustus knew that the empire must eventually pass into other hands. The man chosen to succeed him was Tiberius. Tiberius had served Rome faithfully as a military commander and provincial governor. He had led campaigns along the empire's northern frontiers. His leadership had brought stability to several troubled regions. Though he possessed a reserved personality, Augustus believed he had the discipline required to continue guiding the empire. In the later years of his life, Augustus gradually shared more responsibilities with Tiberius. This allowed the transition of power to develop slowly and smoothly. Roman citizens became accustomed to seeing Tiberius involved in important decisions. Meanwhile, Augustus continued reflecting upon the long journey of his own life. The memories of earlier years must have seemed distant now. He remembered the days when the Republic had been torn apart by civil war. He remembered the rivalry with Mark Antony. He remembered the long struggle that had ended near Actium. And he remembered the quiet decision that followed, the decision not to become a king, but to reshape Rome in a way that preserved its traditions. The empire that existed now was very different from the republic into which he had been born. Yet many of the old forms still remained. The Senate still gathered in its marble halls. Magistrates still held office. Public festivals still filled the streets with music and celebration. But behind these familiar traditions stood a new system of leadership, one carefully built by Augustus over many decades. In the year 14 after Christ, Augustus began a final journey through parts of Italy. He traveled with a small group of companions and advisors. These journeys allowed him to visit cities that had prospered during his reign. People gathered along roads and in town squares to greet him. For many of them, Augustus had been the only ruler they had known. His long reign had brought a sense of stability that earlier generations had rarely experienced. Eventually, Augustus arrived in the town of Nola, not far from the place where his father had once lived. There, the emperor began to feel the weight of age more strongly. His health slowly declined. Friends and family gathered around him during these final days. Among them was his wife, Livia Drusilla, who had shared many years of his life and supported him through the long responsibilities of leadership. Augustus understood that the end of his life was approaching, yet the moment itself was quiet. There were no great battles or dramatic events, only the calm passing of time. Ancient writers recorded that Augustus spoke simple words during his final hours. He is said to have reflected upon the long role he had played in the life of Rome, and he asked those around him whether he had performed his part well. Soon afterward, the long life of Augustus came to its gentle conclusion. He died in the year 14 after Christ, at the age of 75. News of his passing traveled quickly to Rome. The city that had watched his rise from a quiet young heir now prepared to honor him as one of the most important figures in its history. The Senate declared that Augustus should be remembered as a divine figure. Temples were dedicated in his honor. Statues were raised across the empire. But perhaps the greatest monument to Augustus was not made of marble or stone. It was the empire itself. The system of government he had built continued functioning after his death. Tiberius assumed leadership. The provinces remained stable. The Roman world moved forward under the foundations Augustus had created. Centuries later, historians would look back upon his reign as one of the most significant turning points in Roman history. The Roman Republic had slowly become the Roman Empire, and the quiet young man once known as Octavian had guided that transformation with patience and extraordinary care. Even today, the name Augustus still echoes through history. It became a title used by later emperors. It came to symbolize authority, dignity, and leadership. But long before the title carried such meaning, it belonged to a child born in the year 63 before Christ. A quiet child who grew up beside the flowing waters of the Tiber River. A child who watched the complex world of Roman politics unfold around him, and who slowly, carefully, step by step, became the ruler of the ancient world. Now the story draws gently to its close. The Mediterranean winds continue to move across the sea. Roman roads still stretch across distant lands. The city of Rome still stands among its hills. And somewhere within the quiet pages of history, the life of Augustus continues to be remembered. For every great empire carries the memory of those who shaped its beginning. And the beginning of the Roman Empire will always be connected to the calm and patient figure of Augustus. When the news of the death of Augustus reached the city of Rome, it spread quietly through the streets. Messengers arrived from the town of Nola carrying the announcement. At first, the news moved slowly, passing from house to house, from shop to shop. Rome had lived under the guidance of Augustus for more than 40 years. For many citizens, it was difficult to imagine the world without him. In the early morning hours, people gathered in small groups across the city. Some stood beneath the tall columns of temples. Others gathered in the forum where Roman public life had unfolded for centuries. They spoke softly about the emperor who had guided the republic through its transformation. Many of the older citizens remembered the difficult years before Augustus rose to power. They remembered the long civil wars. They remembered the fear and uncertainty that had once filled the streets. To them, Augustus had been the man who restored calm to the Roman world. The Senate soon assembled to discuss the events that had taken place. Within the marble halls where so many debates had once occurred, Senators now reflected upon the life of the ruler who had guided Rome for decades. After discussion, they made a decision that carried deep symbolic meaning. They declared that Augustus should be honored as a divine figure. This practice was not entirely new. Romans sometimes honored exceptional leaders with divine status after death. Yet the decision to deify Augustus showed the enormous respect he had earned during his long reign. Preparations began for a grand funeral ceremony. The body of Augustus was brought from Nola to Rome. The journey followed the familiar Roman roads that crossed the countryside of Italy. Along the route, citizens gathered to pay their respects. Farmers paused in their fields. Travelers stopped along the road. Many people had lived their entire lives during the reign of Augustus. To them, the passing of the emperor felt like the end of an era. When the procession finally reached Rome, the city prepared for a ceremony unlike any it had seen before. The body of Augustus was placed within a grand funeral procession that moved slowly through the streets. Senators, soldiers, and citizens followed in respectful silence. Images representing Augustus's ancestors were carried through the procession. These wax masks had long been part of Roman funeral traditions for noble families. They reminded observers that the emperor belonged to a long lineage of Roman history. When the procession reached the Campus Martius, the great open field outside the old center of Rome, the final ceremony took place. A great funeral pyre had been prepared. According to Roman custom, the body of Augustus was placed upon the pyre, and the fire was lit. As the flames rose into the sky, witnesses later claimed to see an eagle rising upward from the smoke. Some believed the eagle carried the spirit of Augustus toward the heavens. Whether the story was symbolic or literal mattered little. It reflected how deeply people respected the emperor who had shaped their world. Meanwhile, the transition of power continued smoothly. Tiberius had already been carefully prepared to succeed Augustus. The Senate confirmed him as the new leader of the Roman state. The system Augustus had built proved strong enough to survive the passing of its founder. The empire continued. Governors remained in their provinces. Armies guarded the borders. Ships carried grain and goods across the Mediterranean. Rome moved forward. In the months and years that followed, monuments dedicated to Augustus appeared throughout the empire. Temples were built in his honor. Statues were placed in cities from Spain to Syria. Citizens referred to him as the Divine Augustus. Yet perhaps the most lasting memory of Augustus was not found in statues or temples. It was found in the peace that followed his reign. For generations after his death, the Roman Empire continued to enjoy relative stability. Trade expanded, cities grew, roads connected distant regions. Historians would later look back upon this era as the beginning of the Pax Romana, the long Roman peace. The system of government Augustus created allowed Rome to manage its vast territories for centuries. Later emperors adopted his title. The word Augustus itself became a symbol of imperial authority. Yet behind the title remained the memory of the man who first carried it. The quiet young heir once called Octavian. The cautious politician who rose during the final days of the Republic. The patient leader who guided Rome through its transformation. Even long after his death, stories about Augustus continued circulating among Roman writers and historians. They wrote about his calm personality. They wrote about his careful decisions. They wrote about the extraordinary journey that had taken him from a young noble in Rome to the ruler of the Mediterranean world. And so the story of Augustus remained woven into the long history of Rome. Years passed.
then decades, then centuries. Empires rose and fell, cities changed. Yet the name Augustus continued to echo through history. And even today, more than 2,000 years later, the memory of that quiet and patient leader still remains. The winds still move across the Mediterranean Sea. The hills of Rome still rise above the flowing waters of the Tiber River. And somewhere within the long story of human history, the life of Augustus continues to be remembered. Now the night grows quiet. The rain continues to fall gently outside. And our journey through the life of Augustus slowly comes to its peaceful end. Sleep well. And until our next journey through time, good night.